Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to have back on the podcast Ashley Ward. Ashley is a professor of animal behavior at the University of Sydney, where his research focuses on social behavior of animals that include all types of animals, fish, birds, mammals. And he was on the podcast about a year ago, actually. And we talked about his first book, The Social Lives of Animals. And in that conversation, we had a 2.5-hour conversation about cooperation and the many social lives of animals. Ashley is back at it again, and he's got a new book out, and it is fantastic. As I mentioned in the conversation, his first book was great, but the second book is just as good, if not better. And that book is Where We Meet the World, The Story of the Senses. And so he talks about at least the five senses that us as humans have and many other aspects. So we start the conversation by talking about defining sense. What is a sense? And why we focus on the five senses. We talk about how we can know reality outside the senses, or can we? We talk then about the five major senses. We start by talking about the complexity of the eye, some of its evolutionary history, rods and cones. We get all into it. We also talk about how human eyes are different from other eyes of other animals. We talk about the role of beauty and aesthetics. We talk about sounds, the impact of sound and music. We talk about taste and how it evolves over time. We talk about a sense of smell and how it's really important. And of course, we talk about the importance of touch and how that was even more recently. We can see that in the pandemic, where people weren't able to, be with their loved ones, everything on Zoom was cool for a little bit until it wasn't, and how we really do need to have a sense of touch as social animals. Ashley is a wonderful person. He's such a good guy. He's very, very brilliant. He's a great writer. He's such a good science communicator. Really, really good to talk to. We always have so much fun. As you probably hear in the conversation, I really enjoy my conversations with Ashley. We get on well together, and it's just always a really, really, really good time. And I love talking to him. I love talking to him about his research and about animals in general. And can't wait to get him on here again. As always, you can listen to this conversation and all other past and upcoming conversations at my free Substack, Converging Dialogues, at substack.com. So you can subscribe there. I'm also on YouTube. You can subscribe there. So those are all the relevant places. Make sure you get Ashley's book. It's fabulous. And now I bring you Ashley Ward. I am here with Ashley Ward. Ashley, it is so wonderful to talk to you again on the podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. For listeners, if you want to listen to Ashley and I talk about his previous book, that is episode 117, entitled Cooperation in the Social Lives of Animals. I believe the title of the book is The Social Life of Animals, where you talk about cooperation in different species around the animal kingdom. It's a fabulous book, and it was a wonderful conversation that we have for about 2 hours. And you have the I guess not the sequel to that book, but you have the next one in the tank from you. It's called Where We Meet the World: The Story of the Senses. And as I was telling you before we got on here, the first book's great. Everyone should buy it, and it's wonderful. But this one is so good. It's so good. I really, really enjoyed this. I read this in 2 sittings, with all seriousness, and I just really inhaled it. I really, really enjoyed it. So I really like this one a lot.
That's wonderful to hear. I think you probably characterize it more as a follow-up than a sequel, but it all stems from the same thing, just the general fascination that I have with all things to do with biology, really, and I guess particularly in terms of the whole animal stuff and how we perceive the world in this particular case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's what's so cool about it is that, we many organisms have different senses. Obviously, we have at least 5, but trying to look at the senses and looking at it with humans, but also some other aspects of other animals in biology is wonderful. I know you're on the other side of the world, so it's always fun talking to people from the future. um, I hope things are treating you well down under.
Things are great. The only thing is that it's the morning here, it's your afternoon,
Right.
the previous day, which is always hard to get my head around. I don't really know why, but it does mean, unfortunately, that Sydney Airport is fairly active right now. So we're going to get a few airplanes going overhead as we talk.
No, you're totally fine. Okay, so you was this a pandemic book that you write, this one on the senses, or did you already have this kind of starting before when you were finishing the last book? Or tell me about how this kind of came about, I guess.
I had the germ of the idea sort of flitting around in my head for a few years. But yeah, I mean, I think that's fair to characterize it as a pandemic book. You know, we were all obviously locked down and had a little bit more time on our hands in some cases, those of us who were lucky enough not to be suffering the worst effects. And so really it was the pandemic that kind of gave me the impetus to write it. And at the same time, you know, there were some stories coming out of the pandemic about how it affected us in terms of our senses. The most obvious example of that, of course, being touch, which I dare say we'll probably talk about a little bit later. But the isolation that was brought about by the pandemic had some real impact on our lives beyond the more obvious day-to-day things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've I think realized and are still kind of realizing it, that there's nothing kind of replaceable about being in the same room with somebody. Obviously,
Absolutely not.
you know, we've been doing things over Zoom and all these other, you know, virtual kinds of platforms, which are fine. And I think it's been great in some ways, but there's nothing quite like, you know, hanging out with somebody or being with somebody physically in the room with them. And I think, yeah, touch is, you know, all the senses, but I think touch in particular, you know, it's you can't give a virtual hug as much as we try to, or, you know, whatever, a good, you know, virtual handshake. It's just not replaceable, you know.
Absolutely, it is irreplaceable. Although there are actually some sort of tactile haptic devices which have been developed that can potentially do precisely that, or perhaps on a more sort of, I dare say, practical level, potentially might allow doctors to perform operations on people from distances of thousands of miles. So,
Wow.
you know, there is the possibility, at least, that we're developing the technology to transmit touch, but it really isn't the same.
Yeah, no, it's not. Maybe 100 years from now or 50 years from now, but you know, we'll I guess we'll see. So, the first question I want to ask is obviously some definitions here. So, how do you define a sense? And why do we kind of focus on these standard five and not other maybe potential senses, at least for humans? So just kind of define it for us. Why do we get five, and are there other senses that we may have as well?
Okay, I guess the least controversial definition of a sense would be as a faculty which exists to interpret a certain aspect of the physical environment that has receptors which can collect a specific kind of information and then transfer that along nervous communication lines to our brain where it can be translated. So it's a combination of receptor, nerves, and a part of the brain to interpret it in a sense. Why we concentrate on the five? Well, that's a story that goes back hundreds, thousands of years, back to at least the time of Aristotle, if not before, because it was Aristotle, or at least Aristotle's preserved writings, which gave us this idea that we have five senses. And that's kind of intuitive to us. You know, we've got sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And we learn that at school. So we get this idea of five senses. However, it is, of course, a bit of a shortcut to think in those terms. So we do have other senses. We'd be lost, for instance, without our sense of balance. We might not accord it the same respect as the other senses, but nonetheless, it is a sense in and of itself. And really, it depends how you chop up the different senses, but we may have somewhere north of 50 different senses. So I don't know that necessarily putting an exact number on the number of senses that we have is particularly helpful, but if we think about the senses more broadly, it does give us a better idea of how it is exactly that we perceive the world, and that's the important thing, I think.
Could it be that the five senses, so taste, smell, seeing, hearing, touch, could those be more, are they individual senses that we have? But if you're talking about there's numerous senses, are those five maybe a kind of more categorical, if you will? So under the sense of smell or the sense of hearing, there's all these other kind of subsenses that we have that are sort of kind of under that, or are they completely different altogether?
No, they're not completely different. I see what you're saying. I mean, touch itself is really a collaboration between a number of different kinds of receptors. So our sense of touch really, could be maybe 5 or 6 different senses all brought together that we call touch, or that we experience as touch, and perhaps most importantly think of as touch. Our sense of taste, of course, well, that's really not just flavor perception. It's not just the perception of certain flavors in our mouth. It's something which is also the sense of smell also contributes to. So that's really a collaboration between smell and taste, our flavor perception. So yeah, it's a tricky one. It evades really clear categorical breakdowns, but what the brain does so wonderfully is to bring all of these different senses together to give us a unified and unique perception.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how the brain is working and how we're kind of perceiving things. So I'm going to ask before we get into the big five, I guess, if you will, or I think there's 6 you kind of mentioned in the book, but going to ask the deep philosophical question first here. So we understand the world, our world, through our sensorium, right? The things in our senses that come to us. So if you would take another more computational way of framing it, we're getting inputs from the environment, and then we're having certain outputs based on how we synthesize and register them, etc. But do you think there are things outside of our senses that exist and that we could know? Another way you could say that. So this starts to become a kind of empirical question of sorts of, if we can't know it through our senses, does it exist? Or in another way, it may exist, but does it really matter if it exists if we can't know it through our senses? Or is there other ways we could know things outside of our senses? So a kind of phenomenological experience of things. What do you make of all of these types of things?
That's a wonderful question. I don't know that I'm able to give you a good answer, but it's mind-blowing to think, just to take it back to what we can perceive for a moment, it's mind-blowing to think that nothing really exists in the way that we perceive it. The color red doesn't exist. None of the colors exist. Yeah. Sounds don't exist. Smells don't exist. Smells, for instance, that's a crazy one. What we perceive, let's say, as the beautiful, strong smell of coffee first thing in the morning is really just a collection of volatile chemicals which reach our nose, and which, in a way that we're not actually even yet fully clear about, manages to cause our sensory system to give us the perception of the smell of coffee. There's nothing coffee-ish about the molecules that are going up our nose, but our brain interprets it in this way. So is there really such a thing as the smell of coffee? Not really. It is an interpretation. Is there really such a thing as colors? No, there are interpretations too. So really, this is our brain really just interpreting the universe around us, just really constructing the environment from this sort of what I call the jumble of physics that surrounds us. It really it does make people stop and think, and it actually makes people rebel when you tell them there is no such thing as light or sound, or not in the way that we perceive it. They resist that. So is there anything beyond that, which was your original question? Well, I'm sure there is, but what that would look like or feel like to us? Who knows? And the other question that you posed, does it matter? Well, I think it does. I mean, we can't perceive, for instance, at least not in any experimentally reproducible way, we can't really experience the magnetic pull of the Earth. And yet, for many animals that traverse the globe, it's an incredibly important signal. So it obviously matters to them.
Yeah.
That's our senses feel so real to us that it's very difficult to take a step back and say, well, actually, these things are all an interpretation. So, yeah, I don't know quite where that leaves us, but certainly it is one of the most incredible illusions that is perpetrated on us in our entire lives. Probably the most incredible.
Yeah, it's interesting when you kind of break your brain about when you first come to this. When I first kind of come to this and thought about this over time, reading different things at different points in my life, it does create a lot of uncertainty about things for sure. But there is a bigger freedom in it, that I think, because you have to be careful about your perceptions about things that we think are in reality. But there's a idea of there are no, I think, true universals about many things. Maybe for some things there are, but how you're experiencing those aspects or your perception of those things is always going to be a little bit different because each organism's a little bit different. And again, that can cause a lot of, angst or uncertainty, but I think there's also potential freedom in that as well. So it's kind of this paradoxical idea. And there's something so, I don't know if it's a primordial thing, but it's like this intuition of if it's all in our senses, but even that is not stable enough, or I know what the smell of coffee is in the morning. God damn it, I know what that is. I know I had it this morning, I had it this afternoon when it's brewing and everything, but it's not really something that is stable enough or consistent enough to know that through our olfactory kinds of network. And that's I guess the second part is, does it matter? I mean, the philosophical part of me says you all have to be nihilists first before you can find the existentialism in things, right? So you got to know it's all not really there. It's all kind of meaningless, but then you transcend that and say, well, what value or meaning do I want for me? And how do I, live a life or live my life with, the purpose and value I have, where it's not colliding too much in a negative way with other people around you. I think you can get there, but I think it's just really, it's just kind of a mind fuck when you can't even get it to the senses, the major 5 or 6 that we have. Like, now even that is a kind of oh man, I can't. What can I hang my hat on? I guess it's a paradoxical thing, I guess.
On an imaginary hook, I guess. But yeah, it's look, our senses to us feel so objectively real. We can look at a tree and say, damn it, that tree is there and it is green, and I'm telling you it's green. And that feels real to us. It doesn't matter how many times you hear somebody like me saying, well, green doesn't actually exist. People have an experience of green and they're going to believe their eyes. But as you hint there, I mean, our senses really are just taking in data. They're interpreting it, which is the critical part. Yeah. And they're constructing a vision of the world or an experience of the world, which accords with, importantly, what they've previously experienced. So, not only are our sort of receptors different and our individual senses different, our experiences throughout life are different. And all of these come into play to shape how we feel about the world, how we experience the world, how we, the world that we live. And so each of us, I mean, this is one of the most amazing things I think I found in the course of researching and in writing this book, that obviously each of us differs in terms of our senses. That's not just about gender or about age or about anything like that. It's also even at the genetic level. And the ultimate upshot of that is that not only are we different from other animals, we're different from each other. So that not only is my perception of the world different to yours, for instance, but my perception of the world is different to that of anybody else who has ever lived. Not by much, perhaps, but because of genetic differences between us, because of differences in receptor types, because of, experience, wiring, call it what you like, we're all incredibly unique in terms of our senses. And so, we may agree that the tree is green, that the tomato is red, and so on and so forth, but each of us will see it in just that very slightly different way. And I think that's fascinating. I mean, and that I guess is a gateway to not only to the science of the senses, but also to great art.
Yeah, it's interesting is that I've been thinking about this a little bit more recently. Is I think that there's a very impoverished way of thinking for many people in a digital age, unfortunately. I think there's many wonderful things about a digital age, but there's this element where we're not thinking, I think hard enough or critically enough. I don't think we're creating as much anymore. We're definitely not reading as much anymore. And I think that one of the things I think about is that this is the kind of footnote to the bit we're talking here is, your training is in biology. My training is in clinical psychology, right? And through these different disciplines, we're both talking about philosophical underpinnings of this, right? Now, I'm not a philosopher, you're not either, but I think you need to have a good, philosophy of mind, a philosophy of nature, of what that means for, the work that we do. And I think that that's really important because what I'm hearing in this bit here is that, perception is important. The individual experience is important. And you're mapping that onto, some of the genetic, distinctive, differences between each individual human, much less other multicellular or unicellular organisms on the planet. And it's just interesting what is the kind of framework or structure that we're using, what is that philosophical framework we're using to kind of understand things through, a different, discipline or science. And I find that, I think if people have that, there's a really nice kind of overlap that can happen there of trying to say, are we thinking about this with a good structure here, which obviously you do so well. And so it's just very interesting how there's a lot of overlap with a lot of different perspectives.
Completely agree with you. Yeah. I mean, as a biologist, or indeed any specialist, there is the temptation, the possibility that you would approach a subject with a kind of hubris based on your own discipline. But the first thing I think you need to learn about the senses is that a single perspective, say just a biological perspective, isn't going to be enough on its own. You need all kinds of different viewpoints if you're going to make any sense of the senses. So, you need to think about the philosophy behind it. You need to think about, all manner of different aspects. In science, we crave certainty. And that's one thing the senses really can't give us when you knock it right back to the basics. So, I think taking a multidisciplinary approach was actually quite scary for me at the outset of the book, but became incredibly valuable as I went through my research.
Yeah, well, it really comes through in the book, and it's super sharp and very clear, and I think it makes for a strong kind of through line. So let's start with I think it's the first one. I think I went in order of how you go in the book. You start, I think, with the eye. The eye is so fascinating. It's so complicated. And if you ever want an example, I'm going to show my cards here. If you ever want an example of a non-intelligent designer kind of theory. Just look at the eye. It's so almost everybody, wears corrective lenses. It's got so many issues. I mean, like it's an incomplete almost feeling of an organ. But the eye is so fascinating. I remember learning it in my different physio classes I took in grad school, of just like how many weeks and weeks we spent just on the eye. And we talk about rods and cones and all that stuff. It was fun to see all that stuff in the book. So just kind of just give us the kind of snapshot of just the eye and how its function. But what's really interesting is the evolution of the eye. I think you use in the book. I've heard other people talk about, a lot of biologists talk about the flatworm and the kind of lens and things like that. And so yeah, just kind of talk us through or march us through kind of the eye and just kind of basically how it functions. You can start with humans or just you can just pull in other animals, and then we can talk about the kind of front to back thing on the retina.
Sure. I mean, exactly as you say, this is the most wondrous organ. I mean, it performs this extraordinary task, passes vast amounts of information through to our brain. And yet, really, it's the most bizarre collection of different properties that have been brought together to create this. It's something that creationists, as you alluded to, sort of point to as a kind of gotcha moment. How could this possibly evolve? Well, happily, we've got tons of evidence about this, and we've got every stage of the eye's evolution, from the kind of light-sensitive cells, or light-responsive cells you can even get on things like plants, all the way up to more complex eyes. I was about to say up to our eyes, but actually there are better eyes than ours out there in the animal kingdom. So yeah, I mean,
who has better eyes than us in the animal kingdom? I know this is true. I'm trying to remember what other animal has better eyes than us.
So, well, I guess it depends which feature you're looking at, but raptors have better acuity, birds of prey. Mantis shrimps have an incredible ability to process all manner of different properties of the light environment. Cephalopods have remarkable vision too. It depends which aspect you're concentrating on. But
isn't it with cephalopods, they have a similar kind of shape and orientation to the human eye, right? Which makes it so fascinating, because there's a lot of, I guess it's kind of convergent evolution here, maybe, because there's a lot of time and distance and different branches on the evolutionary tree between cephalopods and apes like us, right? I mean, it's very interesting how it's similar.
Exactly. They evolved independently, which is such a beautiful thing to examine. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, an eye like ours, at least, can be relatively simply described in terms of the way that light hits the eye, the surface of the eye and the lens bend that light inwards to this remarkable little patch of, it's actually brain tissue. It's the only part of the brain that can be reached without drilling into the skull, and that's the retina. And sat there on the retina are lots and lots of different kind of sensitive cells, which fizz with excitement whenever they're hit with a light of a certain type, or with a certain wavelength, or with sufficient brightness. And a colossal amount of information is passed by those millions upon millions of cells to the brain. At every fraction of a second, the brain is being bombarded by information from our eyes. So that's essentially the basic functioning of the eye. But really, what we have as an eye is really a throwback to our distant antecedents. Existence underwater. We have this wet eye, which really comes back to where the eye first evolved underwater, where we see a range of colors, which is also to some degree has been dictated by the evolution of life initially underwater. So we have eyes which have been bequeathed to us by our marine ancestors, and which now perform a wonderful job with interpreting the world above water, but to do so need a blinking eye, a blinking eyelid, and all sorts of things to keep them wet. It's really not ideal, but it's a rather beautiful signpost back in time to where our eyes evolved. So yeah, as you kind of well, as you already said, we have two main kinds of photoreceptors on the retina. We have rods and we have cones, both named for their shapes. The rods primarily, their primary business is in detecting levels of light, and they give us a kind of grayscale appreciation of the world. And then the cones, they respond differentially to different parts of the visible spectrum. So, we have some cones which approximate to peak in the red part of the spectrum, others which peak in the blue part of the spectrum, and still a third kind, for most of us at any rate, which peaks. Well, we sometimes say green, but actually it's closer towards yellowy orange. But so with these three different kinds of cones, they triangulate lots of information and they give us our perception of color. So we see really two main properties of light: brightness and color. There are others that we don't see, and that in itself is interesting. But yeah, that's a basic rundown of the eye, I guess, and the vision.
Yeah, that's all. I mean, I think super, super important. And again, there's these different features that other animals have of our eye and vice versa. But um, tell us a little bit about the evolution of the eye. Obviously, it's a very long history, but maybe just kind of the big key um, uh, kind of points along the evolutionary time scale of where we see an eye from out of water, and then where we're seeing it on land, and how it's evolved to what we know.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the genes behind the different components of the eye, you'll see that unlike some more sort of specialized or some other specialized structures, the genes involved in the eye come from all over our genome, which kind of hints, which kind of hints that really the eye is a bit borrowed, is constructed by borrowing a bit from here, a bit from there in an evolutionary process, sometimes known as bricolage. To start with, the cells which are so fundamental in detecting light are common to many, many organisms. Think about when you go out in the sun and you get a little tan. The cells in your arm are responding to light, and it's just that property of responding to light which was really the foundations for what ultimately in us becomes a retina. But being able to detect light is while it's something that plants can do, that fungi can do, that animals can do, that obviously isn't enough in itself just to make an organism successful. What you also need, at least in the very early stages, and that's where we're talking about a flatworm, is the ability to know where light is coming from. So let's say for a single-celled alga, if it can see if it can intuit where light is coming from by having some sort of directionality, then it can guide itself towards the light. The flatworm goes the other way. It's a shady customer. It wants to sit more or less in the dark where it's safer. And how they do that varies from organism to organism. Some of them do it by kind of shadowing effects within their single-celled bodies. Others, like the flatworm, which is multicellular, they have little cups in which these light-sensitive cells sit. So, just like a crater on the surface of the Earth, if the light hits from one anywhere from directly over above, there'll be a slight shadow on one side of that crater. And that's essentially what the eye of a flatworm does. So from this, it's able to divine from where the light is coming, and it can go, in its case, in the opposite direction. We see over time that cup becomes deeper, allowing better understanding of light directions. And then gradually the lip of that particular cup comes together almost to meet, just allowing a little pinprick of light coming through. And that is fascinating because it actually kind of, we perhaps unknowingly replicated that in the early days of cinematography, photography rather, the early daguerreotypes and stuff. The idea of a pinhole camera, a camera obscura, that in itself, just having this pinprick of light, that comes through the mouth of this cup is enough to form a very, very basic image. The next step is that to prevent pathogens and nasties getting into that delicate area, that open cup, some animals developed a kind of very fine covering of skin, transparent skin over the top of that, to keep the bad stuff out. And it's that ultimately became the cornea, the protective surface on our eyes. Built into that, we can get crystallins, these protein structures, which ultimately can be co-opted to bend light more effectively, and also the lens to actually focus light. The light-sensitive cells become more specialized over time. And ultimately what you end up with is the beginnings of the kind of eye that we've got. It's every stage of this particular development, these particular developments is still out there in certain animals. We can see the flatworm that's often used as an example in biology classes, but there are plenty of other organisms which are still at these intermediate stages, and probably in all likelihood will stay there for as long as humanity's around. Mm. So each of these little points in the evolution of the eye remains out there, remains available for us to examine.
It's fascinating how this evolves, and how it, as is true for evolution for many things, it will not continue on. It will stay at one stage for some species. Exactly. And for others. I think you kind of mentioned it, but it does keep going past what humans have. In some ways, some animals are able to see UV light, and they can see in the dark, and all of these other things. So tell us about how, I think of birds. Color plays a big role for birds, for bees. There's a lot of different aspects of vision that are necessary for other animals in different ways than for humans. Maybe talk about some of these more, I don't want to say higher, it's kind of given a kind of attribution to it, but there's definitely a difference in that they can see and do things because of that we can't. And there's a type of, it's interesting because, as we were talking about with that big philosophical point, how would the world look for us if we could, have night vision, if you will, or we could, see UV rays? Yeah, like what would it be for us? Or what are the things we could do? And it would be so interesting. But it does happen that way for other types of animals. So just talk about how it's different in that way, or maybe better in some ways.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Now, of course, we can use computer vision to kind of give us the simulation of that kind of experience, and we can start to appreciate what it is that other animals see. So we can see, our part, the if you like, the human-centric part of the visual spectrum, but going off to either side, on the one side is sort of infrared, on the other is ultraviolet. Excuse me. So infrared will be what we will be talking about when we're thinking about night vision. It's an important component of night vision. Unfortunately, since we're warm-blooded animals, having cells, visual cells which respond to that part of the spectrum is difficult, because the heat of our bodies kind of interferes with that. So hence we need equipment like night vision goggles and things like that to do the job for us. But for other animals, for instance, some kinds of fish, their vision does go into that part of the spectrum. And what that allows them to do, of course, is to navigate more effectively under certain conditions underwater. Amphibians too are pretty good at this. Some people might say, but what about, say, vampire bats? They're warm-blooded and they can see infrared. Well, they don't exactly see it in quite that same way. They have specialized organs which allow them to home in on heat, but it's not quite the same as vision. Similar with snakes, they follow the heat of their prey's bodies, but they do so in a way which is akin to, but not exactly the same as vision. At the other end of the spectrum, ultraviolet is something that we're not capable of seeing. And I should say that, it's kind of, as you say, not a good idea to make sort of value judgments about who's got the best this or that, or which is higher, which is lower. But, we are, of course, fundamentally mammals, and mammals evolved in this world in which first appeared and spent a very large part of early mammalian development under conditions in which dinosaurs were rampaging around the earth and eating anything that that dared stick its nose out of a burrow. And that meant that really our mammals evolved under conditions where they were just desperately trying not to get eaten by the undisputed rulers of the earth at the time, the reptilians. That meant that ultimately they lived either nocturnal or burrowing underground lives, or both. And that bequeathed certain properties to mammalian vision. And that's why, in terms of color vision, at least, color vision being relatively unimportant at night or underground, that's why many mammals, think about your dog, your cat, or really pretty much any mammal you could name, have relatively poor color vision. So when you tell your poor dog to go and fetch the red ball, he or she has no concept of the color red. We, however, as primates, are lucky because at a certain point in primate evolution, a genetic mutation gave us the additional cone that has given us in turn this beautiful color vision. So in terms of mammals, we have really quite good color vision. But notwithstanding that, we still don't see in ultraviolet. Although some people who have undergone eye operations are actually able to see the faint glow of you barely ever see them anymore. But those ultraviolet machines they used to check banknotes with, they can see the glow from those following certain operations. Small recompense, I think, for the damage that unfortunately has happened to their eyes. But yeah, in terms of ultraviolet light, this contains a huge amount of important information for certain animals. For instance, it's a facility which is used by many bird species, by bees as well. It allows animals to navigate the world more effectively and more efficiently. Think about pollinators such as bees. The way they see the world, the way they see the patterns on flowers is something which we can barely imagine. But it's almost like some flowers almost have landing strips for the bees that are encoded in the colors of their petals. Birds communicate with each other in terms of their plumage using colors which are only really available or visible through the ability to see ultraviolet. And so, for instance, starlings are relatively common throughout the Northern Hemisphere. To us, they look relatively bland, but seen from the perspective, aided by computer vision, seen through this perspective, they're an absolute riot of color. So the way that we see the world is not objectively necessarily how other animals do. A further example of that, just quickly, is when we go to a coral reef, and I tell the students this is one of the most intense predatory environments on the planet. And the obvious question that the students often ask about that is, well, if there are so many predators, if there's so much danger here, why are the fish so brilliantly colored? And the answer is because when you look at the world through a fish's eyes, if you like, those colors are so different to the way that we see them. A brilliant yellow damselfish, for instance, stands out to us like a beacon as it swims through the water above a coral head. To another fish, however, it looks really quite gray. So, yeah, I guess it's just an indication of the way that we see the world and the way that other animals see the world is very, very different. Ultraviolet and infrared are two parts. Another part is polarized light. That gives a huge amount of information again to bees, which we mentioned earlier. It's something we can't see. It's a third property of light, but one that we can't see. But it's one that can be used and has actually been harnessed by people to find their way around. The Vikings interestingly managed to work out a way to see polarized light, or to be able to use sunstones, as they call them, these crystals, to be able to find the sun on cloudy days by essentially picking out polarized light.
Mm. Yeah, it's just so interesting, the different aspects of light, and especially with bees. It seems to be with flowers and color and bees a coevolution in
Yeah.
and how they evolved, and it's just really really fascinating. I guess on the last thing here, I guess on vision is, if we're seeing the world in one way, but animals see it in different ways. Interestingly, if you take the tenets of sexual selection, there is a role of beauty and aesthetics. It depends on, I guess, also, who you ask as well. There are many people that will uh, have many things to say about beauty and aesthetics and the role of that. It's just not all just about necessarily sex or for procreation. Sometimes it can be from other things. But what do you think about with vision, the role that beauty and aesthetics have uh, for many animals or different animals, and for us as humans, based through this idea of vision?
Yeah, so that's something I sort of dip into in the book, and it's a bit of a minefield, of course, because beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, the concept of what beauty is something, of course, that has been debated by philosophers for millennia. We each have a slightly different perspective on what is beautiful and what isn't beautiful. And yet, at the same time, we also agree quite a lot as well. This is shaped by our culture, by our experiences, by all sorts of subjective inputs.
So I guess the question here about vision is, how do we understand, I guess, more abstractly, so much of our ideas about beauty and aesthetics are not only unique to humans, so we can understand certain aspects of sexual selection for other animals, but I guess for us as humans, since that's probably the best information we have, how do we, I guess, what is the role, I guess, in how we define what is, beauty, and what is, aesthetically pleasing, based on our sense of vision. That's how we get a lot of those ideas, from that one sense. Um, yeah, and you mentioned this in the book. So what are your, I guess, thoughts on the idea of beauty and aesthetics?
Yeah, so the idea of beauty is a fascinating one. I mean, it's something that's been debated by philosophers for millennia, with some philosophers coming down on the side of the idea that beauty is an objective property, that there is something genuinely beautiful about something, that it can be appreciated by all, and others arguing from the other perspective, which is that beauty really is a subjective thing, and that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And the truth, as so often, lies somewhere between those 2 points, although which one of those poles that you go closest to depends, I guess, on your own personal perspective. Evolutionary biologists have tried to define aesthetics and beauty in the world around us, in terms of beauty being some kind of property which encourages us to make good decisions. So, for instance, we may see beauty in a landscape, and that landscape potentially will be some place which at least in prehistoric times would have been a good place for us to live. Often if you see a landscape picture, it'll probably have woods, i.e., shelter. It'll probably have a lake, maybe, i.e., a source of water, and potentially an important resource for our prey animals. So it's in this framework that evolutionary biologists have tried to explain it. In terms of mate choice, beauty encourages us to, I guess, make good choices of partners, in terms of picking a partner who is going to produce healthy offspring, and is going to be fecund, and is going to be able to produce large numbers of offspring, I suppose. That would be the evolutionary explanation for it. But in our day-to-day lives, of course, things are a lot more complicated than that. We can't distill anyone's characteristics or anyone's value down to any single measure like that. We know what we like when we see it. And I don't think we necessarily look around when we're, say, on a dating app and think this person looks like they could have more children than that person. The human mind doesn't work like that. But yeah, these I think are at least starting points for a discussion about what is beauty, and I guess also by the same token what isn't. But it's a very, very hard one to answer.
Yeah, it is. It is a fascinating one. Um, I had uh, is it Richard Prum? He wrote this book on the evolution of beauty, um, and he's an ornithologist and kind of created some of the phylogenetic tree for birds and things like that. And super, super, super awesome, wonderful guy. We had a long conversation about his book, which is I've read it a handful of times. It's really good, but he has obviously his critics, and he believes that um, beauty is not just for sexual selection. That there are other things going on with animals and including ourselves, and um, it's absolutely fascinating. It's
Yeah,
so fascinating to think about beauty and aesthetics in the natural world and how we create beauty and why it's important or why it isn't. And obviously a large part of that is large part of that is through vision. Although you can hear a piece of music and also say that's a beautiful
absolutely.
melody or thing. So there's that piece of it as well.
It's a wonderful
Which
perspective. So, sorry, just one
yeah
really interesting thing that I found whilst I was doing the research for the book was that, we look at the people around us, and we may get a certain feeling as to who we find attractive, maybe who we think is more generally just beautiful or what have you. But there's a really interesting experiment whereby they took the faces of a large number of people and then amalgamated those using a computer program to produce the average face from all those people. And the result of that was startling because if you like, the average person, you would expect that person to be relatively middle of the road, relatively, fairly attractive, but not very attractive. Actually, the person that was created by this averaging process was more attractive than any other single person that went into creating that image. And I think what that tells us is that actually we're not looking for someone who is, say, unusually beautiful. What we're looking for is someone who corresponds roughly to the population norm, if you like. And so that changed the way that I kind of viewed this particular question. It's this average face is one where the features and the quirks of individual people have essentially been ironed out by the averaging process, and what we get is something that's actually, in any other walk of life, you'd think of this averaging process producing something which is bland and lacking in characteristic features, and yet that face is by the people who judged this thing in the experiment about which I'm talking, was the one that nearly everybody found the most attractive. So I think that is interesting. I think your correspondent is absolutely right. That there is more to beauty. There is more to our perception of aesthetics than simply talking about mate choice. Yeah. Nevertheless, mate choice has played a very, very important part in that, and it does, like I say, gives us a starting point in this fascinating field.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump to sound. Sound is super, super interesting. I'm a big music person, so sound is when people always have these things where they say if you couldn't have one of your 5 major senses, I can never say which one I don't want. I would be oh man, music is huge for me. It's huge. So sound is one way of interacting with that, of course. You talk about the different aspects of sound. So as opposed to more of just the kind of, I guess, biology of it, I guess I'm interested in some of the things that you bring up. Is sound has the ability to impact our mood and our emotions, which is super interesting. Different pitches can impact our mood. Mm-hmm. How do you look at this way in which sound can really impact our emotions and our mood? I'll give one example. I as I it's always a kind of like large stimulus, but as I watch films now, I watch all the technical things that I didn't used to when I was a kid, or I notice it more. And I recently was watching. I think it won the Oscar for this category, but I was watching it's the third remake now, but All Quiet on the Western Front. Fabulous movie,
Yeah.
fabulous movie. And I've seen the original too, which is also good in its own right from 29 or 1930. And but one of the things that is super powerful about the film is obviously sound that's there. You want it to sound believable. Um, but the score is there's like these big, like thunderous kinds of like bass tones at certain moments where it's like this ominous kind of thing. And like when you're taking all of these things, I remember I've seen the new one twice, and I remember watching it, especially the second time, where I was like, wow, like this is like heavy mood, right? Just like, oh, like, it's a war film and stuff. And World War One was pretty brutal, trench warfare, all that stuff. But it was the sound and the score pushed it. It pushed that kind of mood and perception and how we were, as a viewer, just to try and say like, oh, I'm in a different space now, which would have been, I think, different if you didn't have that. And so this is a kind of a fun example, but you can think of other examples, high pitched versus low pitch, or, so tell us, just about the impact that sound has on our mood and our emotions.
Absolutely. I mean, is there another sense which can make us feel so insignificant as sound in these kinds of contexts? I mean, I talk in the chapter about as a child being at a cliff top with a huge storm rolling in across the North Sea, and the sights were incredible. The various sort of sensory inputs, but the thing that cowed me, the thing that made me so terrified, was this thundering bass of the waves smashing against the cliffs, and the whistle of the wind as it nearly blew me off my feet. And so it was really the sound that created that environment, and a little bit like in the way that the score really makes All Quiet on the Western Front, or indeed, where would Jaws be without that incredible score? Halloween, same. These what the director called cattle prods of sound. We can be directly manipulated by sound, and in a way which really the other senses can't provide for us. One of my favorite examples of this actually is, our sonic range. The sonic range refers to the range of human hearing, and that starts roughly, it varies between us, of course, but it starts at roughly 20 hertz, 20 cycles per second. If we go just a fraction below that, say 19, 18, even 17 hertz, we can't hear it, but it is such a deep bass that we can feel it. Some people can. But what people report when I won't say hear, I'll say experience, when they experience sounds, especially loud sounds around this thing, they don't hear it, they experience it. It makes them feel incredibly uneasy. Yeah. And it's something which is, so people walk into a house and they feel really uncomfortable about something. And sometimes they put that down to supernatural phenomena. It's interesting just how many examples of haunted houses can be explained by the presence of underlying natural sine waves of around 17 or 18 hertz, So this is something we're not even conscious of it, and yet it's influencing our moods. It's making us feel weird and uncomfortable. At the other end of the scale, so our hearing range goes up to about then 20 kilohertz, 20,000 cycles per second. I mean, only babies can hear that, and very young children. As we get older, we lose about a hertz a day, something like that. So I can no longer hear the highest pitched sounds, but very, very high pitched sounds draw our attention immediately. Think about the cry of a baby, for instance. That's something which really, it's absolutely unignorable, and there's a reason for that. I know that the babies who cried at that frequency were attended to. It's a very strong selective pressure, so babies are selected to cry at a frequency that we simply can't ignore. which is no consolation to people on an aeroplane with a crying baby on it, but still. But the interesting thing is that if there's a universal noise or a universal sound of communication in the animal kingdom, it's probably the scream. When people were given different sounds made by different animals, and asked to interpret what they meant, people couldn't really intuit what was meant by almost any of the sounds that were made, apart from one, and that's the scream, because nearly all animals scream at a high-pitched sound. And it's, if you like, the universal signal of danger, and it's universally understood to be to mean that an animal is scared. These really high-pitched noises go, straight into our brains, and sort of trigger a fight or flight kind of response. So anything in that's very sudden and very high-pitched, say the scraping of I'm sorry to do this to your listeners, but the scraping of say cutlery across a plate, or something like that, or nails down a blackboard, anything that gives us these screechy sounds, it just it gives us a visceral feeling of strife, if you like. So yeah, sounds just singular sounds like that play an incredibly important part in our lives. And then when we combine sounds and we arrange sounds and we come up with something like music, then of course it contributes so much to our lives in a very different way.
Yeah, and again, going back to the subjectivity, I mean, I don't think anybody I know I love the sound of nails on a chalkboard. That sounds great. No, I'm saying I don't think I know anybody that would say that.
Fair enough. Sorry,
which is the point, right? That's the point. It almost is like a universal. I do think it is a thing of that. Maybe it's maybe some people don't. It doesn't bother them as much, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone say they find enjoyment out of it. It's interesting about music because this is so subjective. I mean, it's so subjective, the combination of sounds and how you can put them together and to make melody and rhythm and all these harmonies. And it's interesting to always get that subjective, perspective that, I can like something so much.
Yeah.
And then I let someone else listen to it and they're like, that's terrible. I don't like any of that. That's
such a
awful.
disappointment, isn't it, when that happens? When you
right.
You share it and they go, oh, that sucks. That's awful.
But it also depends on how. It's sort of the same with film. I think with sound is a little bit more, or music rather, is more maybe visceral. But I think it's something that is. It really depends on the person and what they're looking for and how they listen to music. I've realized is how I listen to music. I mean, I know it's true for everybody, but it's just really different than, I'm listening to different things and my analytical brain is turned on and I find enjoyment out of that. But so I like stuff that's usually very busy. Like I can listen to heavy metal or fusion jazz or, something like that. And you're like, that's too much going on. There's too many things going on. I need just something real straightforward. But I like that stuff too. And it's interesting how we have these different connections with music. And obviously that's, primarily through sound.
It's a lot to do with our culture on one hand and our development, what we're experienced with. I'd have to make an awful confession, but I really, really dislike jazz, especially modern jazz. But the mere fact that many, many people love it suggests the problem isn't with the music, but with me. And there's been some really fascinating research which has looked into exactly, why it is that we like particular kinds of music or dislike others. And I really, I'm simplifying it here, but one theory behind it is that, the more we're exposed to it, particularly in early life, to a particular genre, the more we kind of learn its kind of rules, how it's operating. Beyond that, what we're after is, or what our brain is looking for as the brain is this incredible pattern seeker, pattern recognizer. And the brain is essentially looking for the pattern. It's got to follow these rules, but not too closely. If it follows the rules too closely, the music becomes predictable. Think about a nursery rhyme, and it doesn't stimulate us.
Right.
If the brain can't pick up any pattern. It can't pick up these rules. It doesn't understand where the music is going. It frustrates us and we don't like it. It's somewhere in between these two. There's a sweet spot where the music follows the rules enough, but surprises us just enough that we really enjoy it. We get a kick out of it. Now, what's happening with me with jazz is that I'm not really understanding the rules. So to me, maybe what other people sounds like this amazing score, this fantastic track, to me just sounds confusing and challenging, and I get this negative reaction. But if I was to invest the time, and here's the other thing, you can teach yourself the rules of a new kind of music. So I'm not stuck with always hating jazz. If I'm prepared to invest the time to learn, if you like, the very I say rules as though, you know, it was something built out of a flat pack. Obviously, it's not, but there are certain processes within music which recur throughout genres. If I was to invest the time to learn jazz, I would eventually come to appreciate it. So yeah, we're not stuck, but we are really strongly shaped by our early life and what we did when we're growing up.
Yeah, I think it depends. Yeah, culture, personality, experiences. I think with music, it's interesting because some people get to it. You know, I've said this, I think, before in other conversations. You know, I never got the big deal with the Beatles for a long time. I couldn't get it. I know everyone like you know, just lauded them and they're amazing and all this and that. I just kind of thought they were overrated for the longest time. I was like, I don't get it. It's not because it's old. I mean, that the timing of it doesn't bother me. It's just I just was like, all right, like, you know, I don't play guitar and I could play these songs. Like, it's not that difficult. Like, and it took me a long time to kind of get it. And I had to have people explain it to me. And like I said, you sit down and we're going to listen to this together. And I need you to tell me what's going on and why this is so amazing. And
Beautiful.
once I got that, then it's like kind of like the veil's pulled over and it's just like, oh, I see it now. I totally get it. And I quite enjoy the Beatles now.
So
I guess
that's what I need with modern jazz. You see, I need somebody to sit down and to explain.
Someone sit down and listen to Miles Davis with you. Yeah, I think with jazz. I mean, my understanding of this. I mean, I'm not a big, you know, kind of jazz expert. Excuse me. I think with jazz is you can't expect anything. You can't have predictions, and there's a big freedom in that. But the biggest thing to look at with jazz is themes. This is what I find with jazz is you find a theme, and then it's how in the improvisational piece, how do we find all the different iterations of that? You know, we're going to take this theme and we're going to just, you know, the sax player's doing this and the trumpet's doing this and then the piano's doing this. And then how do we get all that to kind of go enough together? And when you're kind of thinking about it thematically as opposed to linearly, I feel jazz hits better and more because it is a big in the moment creative kind of thing. And to see where are people going with it and where are you going to go with it together with somebody. This is, I think, it's a little bit more structured, but this is like with progressive music, whether it's, you know, prog rock from the 60s and 70s or whether it's, you know, some of the more progressive, you know, kind of metal or hard rock stuff that goes on now. It's a sort of thing. You'll have these big 15-minute songs, but it's themes. And then because it gives you that it's definitely something to have your patience with, but it's when you hear that theme in a different key or a different scale and it comes back and it gives that resolution in a different way, it's so satisfying, right? But you have to, it's a different kind of listen, right? If you're just looking for the kind of like 4/4 verse, chorus, verse, maybe a bridge, that's a little bit different than jazz or, you know, other types of genres of music. But that's the really interesting thing is that everybody's different. Everyone's going to pull for certain things. And what I think as I got older, learned that how do I find, I had a long conversation with a friend of mine about this on the podcast where we talked about appreciation. the idea of appreciate. Why do we appreciate, or should we appreciate certain things? It was a really interesting conversation, and music came up. And I've as I've gotten older, I've found with different sounds and with music particularly, I basically have to set myself with those rules and those sort of expectations, that kind of schema, if you will, and I can appreciate it more. If I'm not comparing it to other things, this is better or not better than this, then I can find the value in it. And then your horizon just it pushed further, because now I can listen to the Beatles and I'm like, I get it. I mean, I get it now. I get it. I mean, I can listen to Radiohead. I thought they were terrible for a long time. Now I get it. I get Radiohead. I get it. So still a little misanthropic for me, but I get it. It makes sense. It makes sense.
It's interesting though. People can when they're confronted by a sudden change in things, can get very annoyed by it. So this is an anecdote that I heard. I obviously wasn't there to experience it, but obviously, if you trace the path of Western classical music from back in its earliest stages all the way through the Romantic period and so on and so forth, there's an evolution and a change, and people have adapted to that. People still, of course, have their favorites, but they adapted to it. It didn't viscerally make them angry. But I believe I'm right in saying that when the Rites of Spring was first performed in the early part of the 20th century, people stood up and walked out of the concert of the concert hall. They were furious about it. They thought it broke all the rules. It literally angered them. The music angered them, and these were people with a strong appreciation of what at the time was the main form of music that they were that they were used to. And so, music has this ability to potentially make us angry if it doesn't satisfy what we've come to expect. But at the same time, of course, as you say, far more importantly, it brings us an incredible amount of joy. And nothing, I think, exemplifies that better than something I relate to in the book, which is, we think of Stone Age people as living short, hard lives of perennial struggle against the cold, against hunger, against violence, what have you. And yet these people thousands and thousands of years ago were still making musical instruments, basic musical instruments. One was southern Germany, which was essentially they'd taken the leg bone of a bird, a little like a vulture, hollowed it out, made little holes in it, and essentially created something like a penny whistle. So music is that important to us that they were prepared to invest the time, take time out from this tough, challenging schedule to make a musical instrument. Music is incredibly important to us. There's no getting around it.
Yeah, no, just say on that. I mean, I've heard this before. I don't know if it's the same one or if it's just a very early one, but when I was in Brussels, in Belgium, I went to the Museum of Musical Instruments. I think there's a few of these around the world, but it was, I wasn't there for very long, and I wanted to see some things, just doing the tourist thing, and I saw there was a Museum of Musical Instruments, and I didn't know if we have one here in the States. And I said, well, this sounds great. I'm a big music lover. Let's do this. So I go there, and it's cool because you get the kind of like the headset, and what you can do is you there's like a small, looks like a kind of like an old iPod kind of thing. It's like a device, and each you go around, it's like 3 or 4 floors, and you go around the museum, and they have all these instruments, obviously behind glass or whatever, for the most part, from all over the world, from Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, all over the place.
Amazing.
From all different millennia. It's amazing. It's amazing, right? And what you can do is you can, on the headphones, there's a number underneath, kind of like a label, and then there's a number, and you push the number on the device, and you can hear the device, the instrument, which is marvelous. It's marvelous. It's such a wonderful experience, because I was like, well, I'm gonna go and just gonna see instruments hanging around, but the fact I could hear it, and it wasn't like on a screen or TV, and it was you could walk around. So it was so cool. But one of them, I forget where it was in the museum, was one of these kind of from like a leg bone or whatever. It was like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. One of the first musical instruments. and it was a type of whistle,
Yeah,
and hearing that was, I mean, just, you know, it was spectacular. It was, but it's interesting, exactly what you're saying. For a long time in our evolutionary history, we've taken time out to create sounds or to create music that does impact our mood one way or the other. And I think that that's super interesting for our human evolution.
absolutely. I mean, we hear a familiar track, something that is emotionally important to us, that hits just the right spot, if you like, in our ears and our audible brain. But we get a squirt of dopamine, this sort of reward.
Hmm.
So clearly it's important to us, but also many of your listeners, certainly myself, have experienced this feeling of frisson, where suddenly you hear this thing and the hairs stand up on the
Yeah. Oh,
backs of
yeah.
your arms. It's a wonderful feeling, but there are very few things in life that can give you that extraordinary feeling, but music is certainly one.
Mm, yeah. It's really interesting how, how this works. So I want to jump to taste. Taste
Uh,
is fascinating. We'll get to the last two major five senses, but I want to give some time to taste. It's something that I've been super interested in over the past couple of years. Um, you said that there's five primary tastes. You can kind of go over those. So we have 5 to 10,000 taste buds for humans, but other animals have less and have more. That was super interesting. I didn't know that. I guess the one key question here, though, is why, or how rather, do our taste buds evolve as we get older? I've certainly had this happen to me. And I know other people have told me this, things I would never eat when I was 25, I'm now eating. What's going on in our mouth? Like, what is going on? So you just kind of give us the overview of the, five primary taste buds and all that, but how does this evolve and change within our own development?
Well, there's good news and bad news here. I mean, we can cultivate a certain ability, our tasting ability. All of our senses are very, very trainable. Okay, that's one thing. So our senses adapt according to our lifestyles, and we get certain parts of our senses are upregulated if we activate them more, and hence professional tasters can really train their senses. And so that's one thing. We can train ourselves potentially to like foods that at first perhaps we found challenging. That's certainly something. But a big part of this, I'm sorry to say, is simply the process of aging knocks out the sharpness of certain elements of your sense of taste. So that, when you taste say cabbage or Brussels sprouts when you're a wee kid, what you're tasting really is the bitterness. And bitterness is actually our most important taste, although we think of it as perhaps our least important. It's our most
Mhm.
important taste. And those bitterness receptors really kick in for kids. And they just no, they they reject it completely. They spit it out. They don't want a bar of it.
Mhm.
So yeah, as you say, we have these currently five. It's very, very likely to be expanded upon, but let's stick with the five for now. We have, of course, a receptor for salt. We have a receptor for sugary taste. We have a receptor for bitterness, which is basically means alkaline properties that are alkaline. Sourness, which by the same token is acidic. And we also have the most recent member of this taste club, which is umami, which is
Mm.
savoriness. But really, it makes absolute sense for our taste sense to be able to detect the key nutrients in our environment. Umami essentially is a protein detector. Um, Obviously, our sweet detector is our ability to taste sweet things lines up with our ability to taste carbohydrates and so on. The most
Mhm.
important one, as I already said, is bitterness, and the reason that's important is that you know rather than thinking about that taste or really, I guess, any of our other senses as being the means by which we enjoy the world, actually, our senses are form really a protective function. Our eyes allow us to see the approach of a predator or the edge of a cliff that we're about to fall off, for instance. With taste, it's something more immediate than even that, which is that our mouth is the portal to the rest of our body. It's the means by which foreign objects get into us, and for the most part. And bitterness is often a signal of the kind of toxins that plants load their stems and their leaves with to prevent them being eaten by herbivores. And so these toxins, which of course in some cases can of course kill us, are something to be avoided at all cost. And consequently, our system of taste has a huge number of bitterness receptors, a much more diverse range of bitterness receptors than any other kind of receptor in that 5 taste family, which immediately alerts us to the presence of poisons and toxins that we potentially might ingest. In fact, although the tongue map is a nonsense idea, this idea that one part of the tongue tastes sweet, and the other part of the tongue tastes salt, and so on, that of course isn't true. However, there is a particularly intense concentration of bitterness receptors right at the back of our tongues and around the top of our throat, and that is the last ditch kind of defense against us ingesting something which is highly bitter, because that is very likely to cause us problems, and that will cause us to sort of regurgitate with a degree of urgency, which may not be socially acceptable, but still, it's an important part of our sense of taste.
I guess let me. So I can kind of understand about like when we're younger. How is that not static? How is that not? And it's different for everybody, I guess, right? I mean, I've known some young people that they'll eat fruits and vegetables and they like it and it's fun, And how do we? So it's just for example, like I mean, when I was younger, I mean, I didn't eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, so I'm very ashamed to admit it, but I did not do that for a while, and I really got a little worried because as I got older, I said, I need to be healthy. Like, I mean, even if I'm not eating junk food or eating at, McDonald's or something like that, I need greens. I mean, I need to eat this stuff. This is good for me. And there was this kind of like, I slowly started incorporating it one by one by one by one. And I did not like this stuff. Mm-hmm. I legitimately did not, I would almost have I don't say repulsive. That sounds really dramatic, but I would not eat it. I would just spit it out. I did not like the taste, the texture, but now I eat, green beans and asparagus and broccoli and, snap peas and regular peas and Brussels sprouts a little bit and, romaine and kale and spinach. I mean, I didn't eat any of that when I was 19, right? Or maybe a few of them, but now I eat all of it, thankfully, right? My doctor's very, he's less, upset at me about it, right? So how do we just grow into liking this stuff? Like you're saying, there's not necessarily this map, but how do our taste buds over time just be like, we hate this, but now we don't hate this? Like, how does this work?
Well, you can certainly cultivate a taste. I mean, I remember a slightly similar but alternative example is the first time my dad got me a beer in the pub. I was the drinking rules in the UK are different to many other countries, and if you're having a meal,
16, right? You can
no,
drink
actually
beer at
before
16.
that. If you're having a meal in a pub and you're with an adult, you can drink before that. But
oh wow, okay.
So my dad got me a little glass of beer, and I thought it was the most disgusting thing I'd ever tasted. And of course, beer is also alkaline, and so. But now, I'm I've worked hard at this problem. I think I've overcome it because I like beer now. But we can cultivate a taste. But this is a process that starts really early in life. So, there are all sorts of studies showing how what a pregnant woman eats during pregnancy really strongly influences what that child will turn to, even as as a newborn in the first few days of life. So there was a study in France. It concerned a niece this sort of, well, obviously aniseed flavor. And women in the last trimester of their pregnancy would in this experiment, some of them would eat anise, other ones wouldn't. And the results in the babies were really fascinating. That those who were born to mothers who hadn't had anise really were just either indifferent or turned off by the smell or taste of anise when they were suckling, whereas those who had come from mums who had anise in that last trimester, they'd smacked their lips. They were pretty pleased to remake the acquaintance of anise as when they were suckling. So we start to learn about taste very, very early on, and anybody with young children will be no doubt familiar with this challenge that you can face when you try to get young kids in particular to eat their greens. It's very difficult. You get all sorts of things just being thrown from the high chair, rejected outright. They go cross-eyed with fury whenever you try to give them something that is going to be good for them, but which is ultimately triggering their bitterness receptors. But a little bit, just like in the same determined approach that you took, a little bit of dedicated perseverance in the face of obstinacy can help to turn the tide, and you can cultivate your taste. I don't know quite whether you ever go from the point of thinking that it's utterly disgusting to utterly wonderful. Maybe for some people they do, but really you just get more used to these things. The alarm bells which your bitterness receptors initially set off when they first encounter a particularly pungent alkaline with its bitter flavor. Those alarm bells don't ring perhaps quite so strongly once you've cultivated this flavor. Your body, I guess, your brain knows that it can potentially relax in the presence of this flavor, and you can start to work with it. But another part of this is, just as sugar is important to kind of dial down some of the more intense effects of sourness, salt plays a role in reducing the intensity of the experience of bitterness. So, when great chefs from around the world try to combine all the different flavors, the reason that they work so well together is because they're interactive. Salt interacts with bitter taste, sugar interacts with sour taste, sort of melding them in such a way that we get this perfect combination. So it could be that it could be simply that you've dialed down the alarm bells that go off when unusual alkalines come in. It could be to do with adding a little bit of salt, which can just take the worst effects off it. It's a really fascinating question of just how we become acculturated to certain foods that at first seem very, very challenging.
Yeah, I'll say, I think IPAs are pretty overrated.
Oh, I agree completely.
People here in the United States are obsessed with IPA beer.
Same here in Australia. Take the hops away. Thank you very much.
And I've tried to ask this about people, and I can't really get an answer. You know what I feel like it is? I feel like maybe people do enjoy the taste of it, but I feel like a lot of people it's a thing to like, so everyone kind of likes it, sort of thing. Yeah. But and maybe it's just the high alcohol content or whatever, but I don't want to drink hops. I want to drink beer. I just, it's all hops right in the beginning, the middle, and the end. I just don't want to drink 10% hops. Like I just don't get it.
Hops are bitter. So you just like bitter.
But that's the point.
Yeah.
I don't want an overpowering flavor in my beer. I want to, I don't mind if it's strong, but I just don't want it to be hops all the way. Like if I want to just drink hops, I'll just drink it straight. I don't understand, but
100% I'm with you. We should set up a campaign that we want beer flavored beer. We don't want bloody garden flavored beer or something like that. No, just
right. Sometimes it's so overpowering. People, this is a double IPA. I'm like, oh my God, like it's just overload. It's too much. And I think I think some places, maybe have the right kind of mix of it, but it is interesting how, again, some people, when you're talking about these 5 different types of primary taste, some people have just an affinity for more things that are more bitter or more savory or more sweet.
Absolutely.
And it's just really interesting. Our genetics, and then how, I think culture plays a part here. impact some of our affinities or our preferences for different senses, but with taste as well. Um, I guess I want to ask from taste we can move to um, smell or scent. I think if you ask most people, I mentioned before, if you had to get rid of one sense, like if the whole kind of thought experiment, most people would say smell. I think most people
In
like
the
I
West,
gotta
yes.
see,
And
I gotta see, I can need my eyes. I only got two of them. I need my ears. Got to hear stuff. I mean, that's and I got to talk, um, and taste stuff and touch. I mean, we talked about touch early in the beginning. It's super important. Most people would say, smell. If I don't smell anything, it would not be great, but I could live fine. Um, or at least that's the impression people get. Why do you think this is? Why do you think we have a kind of disregard for scent and then maybe you can talk about the process from the olfactory bulbs to the nerve to and then it goes to the orbital frontal cortex and it goes to different parts of the brain. But unlike all the other senses, olfaction goes straight to the brain, and it's not contralateral. It goes straight left side, I believe, goes left hemisphere, right side goes right hemisphere. Not like vision where it crosses, like it does for most things in other senses. But you can talk about the way in which scent works. But why do we give a disregard for scent?
yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, obviously, during the pandemic, a lot of people temporarily lost their sense of smell. And I think that gave many people a real newfound appreciation for their sense of smell, so that when it returned, as it did,
Yeah.
luckily for most people, I think they looked at it with a newfound respect. I myself, I had a bit of an accident a few years ago. So the processes that connect the olfactory epithelium, that basically the site of where the receptors are, right at the top of your nose, connects through a piece of bone called the cribriform plate to the olfactory bulbs in the brain. It goes through that little plate of bone, which, let's just say for argument's sake, looks a little bit like a cheese grater. So it goes through little holes in that. If unfortunately you get a bang on the head at exactly the wrong angle, it basically jars that plate and shears the connections off, so the nerves are broken. That's what happened to me. So I lost a large part of my sense of smell suddenly, and I really, really miss it. So I think when people are saying that they would be happy to lose their sense of smell, they're maybe not thinking it through. They've been a little bit flippant. So yeah, I mean, I miss it enormously, and of course that impacts my sense of taste, and it also has broader implications for the way that I relate to the world too. But why generally we disregard it? Well, I think there's a few schools of thought here. One is simply that as the modern age has progressed, we've tended to move away from highly aromatic environments, say the countryside. We moved to the towns where there's a large amount of pollution, which impacts on the sense of smell. It dulls our sense of smell. We've moved indoors where, okay, there may be certain smelly substances, but it bouquets of flowers or whatever you care to name, good or bad. But really, we live in the modern age, in the West at least, live in a relatively depauperate smell environment. Now, against that backdrop, if we look back a few hundred years, the primary theory behind how disease spread was this miasma theory, which was an idea that disease spread through smells. You go look at the Black Death, people thought that it was smell that conducted this thing. And that was given further credence by the fact that, in the terminal stages of this particular disease, people had a very characteristic, very unpleasant smell. And so smell was then implicated as the conveyor of all things that are terrible. So that's one thing. And then against this background, we have the Age of Enlightenment with all the wonderful things that it brought us. But it placed a premium on direct observation, which usually meant observing things by sight and to some extent by sound. Smell for us in the West has always been a hard thing to nail down. It feels vague, ineffable. we can't directly measure it. And consequently, a combination of these two things, this idea it's a disease spreader and the fact that it seems so hard to get to grips with, led certain philosophers, certain scientists to sort of pronounce their ideas on it being relatively unimportant, relatively primitive, relatively animalistic, and gave this idea that, we were moving away from having an important sense of smell, that really this sort of sense was important to animals, but we'd raised ourselves above animals in this ludicrous idea of the world. So that smell was just a really secondary importance, if that. So that, I think, is really where this comes from. But you only have to look a little more broadly, go beyond the West to look at other cultures and see just how central the sense of smell is to their lives. I'm talking about people who live across the world in parts of Central and South America, Asia, Africa, and these cultures really celebrate smell, and smell is incredibly important to them, and they get a much more rich experience of their lives in general through this. So yeah, this relegation of smell to the second division of our senses is primarily a Western and primarily a modern thing.
What do you think? I think some people can tend to, have a stronger sense of smell than others.
For sure.
And I think this is true for a lot of other senses. But what about with other animals? I mean, obviously, my cat's sense of smell is much better than mine. I mean, my nose is essentially broken. I can't smell anything practically. My cat though is definitely attuned to it, or other animals. Why do we think that olfaction works differently in humans than it does for other animals? Is this just a kind of basic kind of evolutionary survival thing when we have different things? But what other aspects of this do you think that even you can say even just within mammals that there's a difference here? How do you understand this?
Again, partly it goes back to those early days, those early tens, hundreds of years of early mammalian evolution, which occurred at night and underground, where vision remains important. I mean, you can't argue against that, but it does place a greater importance on the other senses, smell being one of them. We, even as scientists working with animals and looking at how animals relate to the world, if you look at the number of papers that are published, more papers are published about vision than about any other sense, even in other animals. This reflects our own worldview of what's important. But in actual fact, there's a realization now that really, for probably the majority of animals on this planet, the most important single sense is smell. Yeah. Excuse me. The most important single sense is smell. So take your cat, for instance. I mean, your cat's sense of vision, our sense of vision, if everything's working fine, is about 20/20. And that simply means we can see something from a distance of 20 feet that we should be able to see from a distance of 20 feet. That's a simplified version, but that's relatively really all it means. Your cat has to be stood for a distance of 4 feet from that same object to see what you can see at a distance of 20 feet, which would put them right on the borderline of being declared legally blind for things like driving. The cats should drive, but I'm just trying to put it into context. So your cat relies then on other senses, and smell is incredibly important. They have incredibly acute sense of hearing, but they have an amazing sense of smell. Dogs, very similarly, they can smell things that we simply can't imagine in concentrations that we simply can't imagine. However, before I give the idea that really we are essentially, just noobs stumbling around in this chemical world, picking up absolutely nothing, we do actually occasionally outperform even dogs when we go head to head with them in scientifically conducted tests of the threshold at which we can smell certain things. not many. It has to be said that dogs can smell most things better than we can, but there are some things that we can smell better than they. And again, this points to evolution. So dogs and cats, primarily carnivores, they can smell things that have been important to them throughout their evolution. The smell of other animals, the smell of things that relate to prey animals, meat, what have you. They're not quite as good at smelling vegetable-based things, which again points to our early evolution as vegetarians, primarily fruit eaters, omnivores probably, but vegetation has always been important to the human diet and was of even more importance back in our early evolution. So our threshold for smelling certain things like that is lower than theirs, which is impressive. We have a much better sense of smell than we imagine, even though there is a tendency to imagine that we are worse than most mammals. We're not as bad as we think, actually, and we can, as you said, train it to be better.
It's interesting how I feel like a lot of people, I mean, I didn't know a whole lot about this in terms of smell. We do have a kind of disdain for it, but I think it is something that if you can grow and learn to appreciate it, it can be something that is, really, really, really important as you're, discussing that it is very, essential, obviously. So last major sense here is touch. We talked about in the beginning. You can go where you want with this. You can talk about the parietal lobes or whatever, but it gets to really about the role of human touch and feeling sensation. There's nothing like a good hug, or pat on the back. Kind of very can be very affectionate. Obviously, there's terrible ways in which you can touch people for in various contexts. You can hit somebody, whatever. I mean, there's obviously negative aspects to it as well, but this idea of touch and feeling and sensation that we have a lot of the times through our hands and feet, but also just through our skin and our bodies as well. We'll talk about this importance for touch for us as humans and where we see that elsewhere in the animal kingdom.
Yeah, so touch is incredibly important, and we have this. We have this, as you say, difficulty because touch can be good and it can be bad. But during, again, the pandemic, we had this situation where people were isolated from one another. And I think it's at that time when people were coining the phrase touch starvation, because we started to realize just how incredibly important it is to our lives to be, to touch one another. So we have two real parallel systems in the human body. We have a system of touch which allows us to explore the world, to feel its physical properties, to pick up information from the surface of an object, or to feel its heft, or just to explore. And often when we do that, we will drag our fingertips across the surface of that particular object, because much like the way that a stylus on an old-fashioned record player works, the kind of dynamic movement of your finger across that will allow you to feel the object much more effectively. It's just how our touch system, our sensory system, and our receptors of touch are developed. So moving our hands across something will tend to allow us to get a better idea of its feel. But that sense of movement is also important in the other sense of touch, the sense that where we come to be touched. And it turns out we have this huge network of nerves in our skin which are really strongly responsive to the touch, really, of other people. And if somebody is stroked on, let's say, their back at a particular speed by another person, actually in the experiments, it could even be a robot operating a paintbrush. But if the hands glide over your back at say 5 to 10 centimeters a second, something of that order, you get this tremendous response, this really intense response from the nervous system, which is fundamentally important to our sense of well-being. It's these two senses of touch operate with slightly different nervous apparatus. They connect to the brain in different ways. But we can see through brain imaging of people that are undergoing this kind of caress, the brain responds to it far more strongly than you might imagine. Many people might think that this kind of touch is sort of peripheral or unimportant, but really the human brain is, I guess this connects to my previous book about, us being social animals and just how much, other primates spend, how much time other primates spend touching and caressing and grooming each other. It all ties into the same thing, which is this hunger that we have to be touched and the rewards that our brain provides us when it happens. So to be without it has caused a real problem. Now, of course, there are all sorts of social mores and cultural differences in this respect. When I was growing up in Britain, sadly my granddad, who I loved very dearly, would no more have hugged me than, I don't know, run a marathon, but he would confine himself to a handshake. It was just not part of his lexicon, his behavioural lexicon. It would have seemed weird to him. And happily now people are in some respects more relaxed about that. But again, there's the other aspect where, you don't want to be seen to be creepy, or, you don't want to invade somebody's personal space. So it's got to be very, very carefully judged. But touch or a caress between loved ones is so incredibly important to our lives. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that our bodies are built for it. We're social animals, and touch has always been an incredibly important part of our existence.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I totally agree. I mean, there's the famous attachment studies that were done with the I think they were rhesus monkeys, and they had like the wire monkey, and then the one that had like the cloth on it, whatever, and the ones that had the more kind of warm and were seen as more appealing to go to were those monkeys did much better, and the other ones I think died or were severely ill if they didn't have some type of something that was similar to the touch they know. And yeah, obviously during the pandemic it was really, really tough for a lot of people. Back then, if you had COVID and you were in hospital, you could see no one, and no one could come. They couldn't even see anybody. It was just and really, really tough. And that happens in at other times in our history as well, where we've been quarantined or whatever. So I mean, I would agree that we are as humans, and I wonder. You do talk about this in your other book, but the social aspect of us as humans, I wonder how much touch is connected or integrated with the sociality of things. It's very interesting.
There was a thing actually, this awful experiment that I came across whilst I was researching the book. It was an experiment conducted by the Holy Roman Emperor, who was, a ruled of this vast sort of potentate in Central Europe 1,000 years ago or so. But in his scholarly pursuits, shall we say, because this guy had clearly a very strange moral compass, he was fascinated to know whether the first language spoken by people, or what that first language was. And he decided it must be, based on the balance of probabilities, either Hebrew or Greek. But to find out, what he needed to do was to take newborn babies away from their mothers, have them raised by nursemaids. And the nursemaids were under very strict instructions. They were not allowed to speak in the presence of the babies. His idea being that once they started to speak, they would reveal what the original language of humans was. The kind of the original language, the starter. And so these nursemaids were each looked after a baby. They were under strict instructions not to talk to them, and they were also, sadly, also under strict instructions not to touch them too much or to handle them too much, beyond basic feeding and basic cleaning. And the results of the experiment were absolutely clear, although not at all in the way that this slightly demonic Holy Roman Emperor thought. Obviously, he didn't find the origins of language, but what he did find was the fact that if babies weren't handled, if they weren't given the incredible power of touch, that even though they were well fed, even though they were clean, and in that regard, at least hygienically well looked after, one by one, all of them died. Which kind of really points to the importance, the incredible importance we sometimes overlook of touch. So really, right from an early age, where we're fundamentally, intrinsically in need of touch, as that awful example sort of demonstrates. Another example, of course, was with the tragic case of the Romanian orphans in the aftermath of the downfall of Nicolae Ceausescu, and but there are many other examples. I think we neglect touch at our peril.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Well, I guess the last question I have is sometimes a question I ask folks is, someone's in a bookstore and they see this beautiful cover on this book. I mean, seriously, I mean, this is a fantastic cover. It's for listeners. It's got flowers on it, but it's a green and a red. Of course, those colors don't really exist.
And nor does the smell that they emanate. No,
right. It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful cover, and it has some aesthetic affinity for myself, at least. And they see this book and they pick it up and they read through it. What is your hope that do people walk away with, and that you can say, yeah, that's what I was trying to say. I'm glad that you got what I was trying to say. What is the one or two things you hope people get from reading this book?
Hey, well, I think my ethos in all of these things is that what I'm dealing with here is something so incredibly fascinating that I think everybody should hear about it. Everybody should know more about it, and it will, I hope, enrich their lives. But the most important thing, and I think about this when I'm lecturing students, not just when I'm writing, you can't inform somebody or contribute in an educational sense to somebody unless you're entertaining them. And so really that's my ethos when I'm writing. I'm trying to be entertaining, because we're storytelling animals. We're animals who enjoy a sort of a narrative, and we respond well to the unfolding of a story. What ultimately I hope people take away from it at the end of it is, I guess, a deeper wonder, not only of how we interpret the world in which we live, but how the brain does an incredible job of convincing us that this, to return to where we started, that this amazing mess, this soup of physical properties out there is something intuitive and understandable. And, if we can understand how sensation in turn becomes perception, if we can start to get a grip on perception, which is one of the massive questions in science. If we can understand perception, we're then at the threshold of understanding consciousness, which in turn is probably the biggest question, I would argue, in the whole of science. So what I'd really like the readers to get is how it is that we experience the world, how we, that's kind of suggested by the title, but what our senses mean to our everyday lives, how we can better understand other people. So, for instance, in there I talk about pain, and all too often with pain, as with our other senses, pain is separate to touch. But as with all our other senses, we can be, sadly, rather quick to judge when somebody says something hurts. They go, that's nothing. Don't be a baby or what have you. But our sense of pain, the pain that we experience, is very completely unique to us, and it really would behoove us to be a little bit more appreciative of the fact that we vary enormously in terms of all of our senses, pain included, and to be a little kinder to one another in this respect, to appreciate that just because I feel something in a certain way, that doesn't mean that another person feels something in a certain way, and that our senses are highly variable, and that our perception of the world differs. And through this, somehow to reach this, reach an idea of that lets us put our own self-importance to one side and tries to experience the world insofar as it's ever possible through the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin of another person. I'd say that's probably where I'm heading with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's very much a needed message that I think many folks need to hear. The book is called "Where We Meet the World: The Story of the Senses." It's through Basic Books. I'm sure you can find it everywhere. Where can people find yourself? Where are the best places to get at you? Either email or social media or
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, Ashley JW Ward. I've got a website, ashleyward.net. And I'm, one of the lovely things about being an author actually has been people reaching out and sending me emails, complete strangers from all around the world sending me an email to ask a question or to say that they enjoyed the book or whatever it is. I mean, maybe the day will come when I find this to be intrusive, but as yet, it's still kind of. I mean, this is makes me sound like a fool, I suppose, but that's never stopped me before. I just find it incredible that I could have been typing out this book and somehow it's reached into somebody else's life somewhere else that I've never met, and has had some impact on them, and I love to hear about that. So yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's all wonderful, and I think that it's nice that you're so receptive to that, and I'm sure that people will enjoy the book. Ashley, this was so much fun. We had so much fun the first time we did it.
Absolutely.
I was so honest when I said I hope you come back again, and I'm glad you did. We had a really nice, wonderful another 2 hours, talking about this book and all the wonderful themes in it. And you're always welcome to come on and talk at any point, and I certainly hope we do so again.
I've enjoyed it so much, and thanks for your time, Xavier. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.